Okay, so we've talked about taking notes during class. Let's now talk about taking notes after class. And I said for me, the main reason to take notes during class is to keep myself awake. But for me, the main reason to take notes after class is A, to build my active recall questions, and B, to consolidate my understanding of the subject, which is why this is in the understand section, because we're still trying to make sure that we understand all of our content before we worry about trying to remember, trying to memorize it. So taking notes outside of class, I think basically two main reasons for it. Number one is to be able to use multiple sources to help understand stuff. So often if we're in a university lecture, it can be kind of hard to keep track of what the lecturer is saying and take down absolutely every detail. And it can be quite tricky to understand the stuff as it's going along, which means we probably need to look over our notes again, and we might need to add more little bits. And going back to the Feynman technique, the ultimate objective is to be able to explain to a 5-year-old or to be able to explain to a friend exactly how this concept works. And so if we ever get to a point where we think, okay, that makes sense, that makes sense, that makes sense, but I don't get how we got from there to there, or that bit doesn't quite make sense. At that point, we're going to need to use different sources, so Google, Wikipedia, textbook, lecture notes, whatever. And then we can consolidate our notes so that when we're looking through it again, we sort of get this more coherent narrative being built up. These days I use the app Notion for that. So for example, if there's something that I don't understand, then I will create a separate page in Notion and sort of add information, usually from Google and Wikipedia. And occasionally, if I have to, I'll go into a textbook and I'll screenshot something using the screenshot tool, shove it into Notion. And so I've got that information if I need it. Other ways of doing it, back in the day when I was in med school and before Notion was a thing, I used to use Microsoft OneNote for this. So I would take notes by hand in class. I would scan them into Microsoft OneNote because at the time I didn't have an iPad, so I was kind of writing on paper. I would scan them into Microsoft OneNote, and then it would result in the pages being kind of vertically down the page. But because Microsoft OneNote, it has a sort of infinite horizontal canvas, it means if I needed to expand on anything, I could sort of horizontally expand on it as much as I needed to. So the main topic would be in the notes, and then I could expand horizontally if I needed to get a histopathology slide or get a diagram or get anything off Google Images just to help consolidate my understanding of the thing. Loads of my friends, including me, when we were in our first year of med school, we were like, okay, at the end of every lecture, I need to make notes on the lecture and then I need to revise from my notes. And the people who did this, unless they were working many hours a day, it became unsustainable because most of the stuff that we were tested on was coming directly from our lecture notes. And the extra stuff that these people were adding, I say these people, like I was doing it myself. The extra stuff that we were adding wasn't that useful. It was helpful for our understanding, but I think it was this fundamental misunderstanding that, we have to take notes from the lecture. And we absolutely do not have to take notes on the lecture for it to work. And I remember in like the Easter holidays before our exams, I would have friends being like, oh my God, I've still got 84 lectures to take notes on, and only then can I start my revision. And that always seemed to sit like not very well with me, because even then I sort of thought that this whole taking notes from lectures thing is possibly a little bit pointless. I think in fairness, it does depend on what subject you're doing. So for example, in medicine, which is entirely based on memorizing a torrent of information, there's hundreds of revision resources out there, and there's so much stuff on the internet that there's almost no need for us to make our own revision notes. But if you're studying something like history or geography or English literature, where you're having to consolidate information from multiple sources to build up some kind of novel understanding or novel picture, then I can completely understand. You obviously do need to take notes because it's unfeasible to go straight back to the source material. You can't go back to Beowulf in order to get some key points from it. It's helpful to take notes on that front. So kind of take this with a pinch of salt. Most of my experience is based on doing medicine, and I made loads of notes when I was doing psychology, which was an entirely essay-based subject. But another key point here is when I was doing psychology, what I did is that instead of taking notes on the lecture, instead I would take notes on specific essay titles. And there is some evidence about this, that when we have a specific aim and we're learning stuff to fulfill that aim, i.e. writing an essay, then stuff is more likely to stick in our brains better than if we're just saying, oh, okay, now I need to learn lecture number 7 in pathology. And so that would be one thing that I would do, even if I was doing an art subject like psychology or English or history. I would focus on tackling the question in an essay or whatever, rather than taking notes on the lecture. But anyway, going back to the main point, I said that point number 1 was that taking notes after class is semi-useful in that it helps build up the picture to consolidate our understanding of it. And the second reason why taking notes after class is helpful is because, similar to in the previous video, we can use the Cornell note-taking system to write questions for ourselves. And so, for example, if we've taken notes in class, then we can look at those notes after class and think, okay, what are the different questions that I can make from this? So let's say we've taken notes on, I don't know, how aquaporins work in cell membranes, or the structure of cell membrane biosynthesis, or the discovery of cell membranes, or whatever. I'm thinking about cell membranes because I recently did a Notion video about that, and that was kind of top of my mind. The recency effect in psychology, it's called. Anyway, let's say we've got notes and all that stuff. Like, the notes themselves are pointless because we don't want to just be rereading the notes. What we want to do is we want to create questions for ourselves based on the notes. So again, what I do is I use Notion, and I use the toggle feature of Notions to write a question for myself. So one of the questions might be, what is the function of the cell membrane? And within that, I would write my notes on the cell membrane, but I would hide them. So the only way I can see the notes on the cell membrane is if I've already looked at the question first. And then I make it a point that whenever I see a question in my notes, I actually think about how will I answer this question, which is active recall in action, sort of the Feynman technique in action if it's a concept that I can explain to someone else. But it ensures that I'm not just passively rereading the notes, I'm actually actively dredging information up from my brain, which, coming back to our main point, the thread that runs through this entire class, is that the more effortful learning is, the more likely we are to make the information stick. And so, yeah, going back to the topic of this video, taking notes after class, I think, is a matter of expanding, using multiple sources to improve our understanding, and secondly, making sure that we've written active recall questions for ourselves in one way or another to help actually consolidate the information, to help use active recall to retrieve it from our brains and to help that information stick. And at that point, when we're going through our notes, we could, even if we wanted to, we could turn it into flashcards if we're using a flashcard app. We'll talk a lot more about flashcards in the remember section because there's a few pitfalls people can run into with flashcards. But yeah, that was taking notes after class. I hope you found that vaguely helpful. Point number one, expand the sources to include multiple sources and understand the topic better. Point number two, please, let's write questions for ourselves so that we can actually use active recall rather than passive rereading. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.